Hey everyone, Necromancer 1040 here. Um, I decided to bring you an update on the meta, more specifically the recent tournaments that have happened as of late. I guess this is kind of a meta analysis video, but I'm not going to go into too much detail for all of the top tier meta decks, because I feel like I've already covered them in the previous video, but I'll point out any specific differences if there are noteworthy differences. But I'm mainly going to talk about the results of the main tournaments that have been going on as of late. So yeah, let's get into it. So the first one is the top 32 breakdown for Pro Play Tour Dallas. It had a 38% representation for Orcus players. There were about six Orcus players, yeah. And then you have Salamangreats, of course, at 13%, along with Altergeists and Magical Musketeers. Surprisingly, Magical Musketeers have actually they've come out of left field and just kind of creeped into the meta. But we'll talk about them in a little while. Thunder Dragons have actually been on the decline for a bit. They had 6% representation at the Dallas Pro Play Tour tournament. Um, that can likely be attributed because I'm telling you, mainly because of their lack of draw power. Yeah, they have Pot of Desires. Yeah, they have Allure of Darkness, but that's just not enough. I mean, they have strong search effects, but I feel like they're setting up these boards way too, way too easily first turn, or like they're going overboard first turn, and then all you need is one good board wipe, and then there you go. They have nothing left in their hand, and all they're really left to do is kind of reoccur cards into their hand from the other Thunder Dragon effects. Which I mean, that's not going to give you any card advantage. Not too much that's going to turn the tide after a board wipe like that. Another deck we have Madolches. They've actually creeped into the meta scene too. Um, they're mainly, I mean, I can say right now they're probably taking advantage of traps. All these kind of like rogue decks are kind of taking advantage of traps, mainly in the whether if it's in the main phase or in the battle phase. I'm telling you, yeah, I kind of sound repetitive here, but um, yeah, the meta isn't prepared for traps. It's mainly just monsters and spells. So when these meta decks that just run monsters and spells, they run into a control deck, I guess, that's loaded up with traps. They can't really respond all too well. I mean, the best they have are things like Twin Twisters or Cosmic Cyclone, but that's about it. And I mean, these are heavy control decks. There's a lot of these meta decks are going to have their plans foiled by just simple trap cards. Next we have Gladiator Beasts. Looks like the new support from Chaos Impact actually really did help them in a great effect. So I mean, yeah, I'm glad to see them back, and they're at a 6% representation, same as Madolches and Thunder Dragon. So it's kind of interesting to see that. Next thing is Sky Striker Invoked. That was kind of a weird spin on Sky Strikers. Yeah, like I've told you before, Sky Strikers they kind of constantly evolve, and they're just known for doing that, and we'll see other instances of that at different events, and we'll get into that in more specifics. But this is a top 38 basic breakdown for Pro Play Tour Dallas. So I guess you could say the top deck of Pro Play Tour Dallas. Well, I'm not saying it. I guess sounds kind of like an understatement, but everyone kind of expected this. Orcust won Pro Play Tour Dallas. The person who took first place in Pro Play Tour Dallas, you could see him if you check out his deck profile. He's using DD Crow and Effect Veiler, two hand traps that haven't been seeing too much play in the more recent past, but especially Effect Veiler. Well, DD Crow, I mean. Effect Veiler has seen kind of on and off play, but DD Crow, you haven't seen him in a while. Turns out DD Crow is pulling his weight more than ever because what you can do is you can discard him to the grave, and you can banish something from the grave too, like a key monster that I don't know, maybe a Salamangrate player may be trying to dump into the graveyard, but then you chain with DD Crow and you stop that Salamangrate player's key play. So that's a great effect that DD Crow has, and something like Ghost Bill and Haunted Mansion doesn't necessarily have. So that's why you would see something like DD Crow kind of edge out Ghost Bill and Haunted Mansion for that reason. And also because hand traps and like I've been saying before, traps in general. Well, if you know the difference between hand traps and just regular traps. Regular traps are just the kind of like violet colored cards, but hand traps can be the violet colored cards, and also they can be these. They're mainly monster cards that you send from your hand to the graveyard. But in combination with other traps, you kind of pull the drop on other meta decks, which I guess you can kind of see some Orcus players using in this format. This first place Orcus deck didn't really use that, but he did use something like Mask Change 2. He mainly used that to get out Dark Law. I'm guessing he used it to chain during the battle phase, or even in the main phase when the opponent was trying to interrupt his turn, and so he just chained Mask Change 2, dump something into the grave so he can trigger off other effects and summon out Dark Law to basically lock out his opponent. So that's a very effective way to kind of stave off the opponent and just kind of like beat him in for the turn. So yeah, it's kind of easy to see how he kind of sweep this tournament with Orcists, being that Orcists are already strong in themselves, but you can't you combined something like Dark Law. That's pretty scary. So also in YCS Dallas, we saw Magical Musketeers. So I kind of talked about this earlier. Um, Magical Musketeers kind of came out of left field. They did, of course, they didn't take first place, but they did make the top cuts. Um, you could have seen them using stuff like Utopia Double, and they basically OTK you. This is the premise of their deck, basically. What they managed to do in this event at Dallas was they used a bunch of negation effects, and in tandem with their destruction effects, they can easily just OTK you with something like a Utopia Double, because you can put out a 10,000 attack Utopia Double and just basically one turn your opponent. So it kind of that kind of suggests why they came out of left field. They took advantage of the OTK strategy and just basically cranked up the intensity on that. So Magical Musketeers, again, they did use proficient use of trap cards, so yeah, that's crazy. On top of with the other negation effects, I'm assuming they use stuff like hand traps, but they're also using regular traps. They're using back row to just weaken their opponent and just keep the opponent's field pretty bare, so they can just go in for the OTK. And so we can also see Madolches from this format benefiting from basically the same thing, traps as well. There was actually one. I saw a deck profile. I can't remember which one, but there's like a Madolche player using like 12 traps. So yeah, that's kind of hard to Twin Twister all of them and Cosmic Cyclone, all of those traps. I mean, you're basically not going to be able to do it. They're going to get some traps off, and now meta decks are just basically like glass cannons. They can put out huge boards, but when they run into traps, they're very susceptible and they can't really do too much. I mean, they can try to recover from that, but if you just keep putting out traps or back row and negating their stuff, there's only so many resources that they can go through before they burn out. And the thing that goes well for Madolche's strategies too is that they've been taking really good advantage of this go second strategy, and I know that's kind of contradictory to the whole trap lineup they're using. You could say like traps are better for going first, so that way you can just spring them on your opponent. But it turns out that Madolches, they can put out pretty scary boards on turn two. So I'm guessing they basically bounce a bunch of stuff from the opponent's field, and then since the opponent doesn't really have anything, then they can set their traps, and then they can uh, kind of pick away at the opponent's field in a sense. So yeah, that's kind of crazy. See Madolche is back. It reminds me back in 2015 times when Madolches were kind of the scary deck back then. So yeah, Magical Musketeers and Madolches. Who would have thought? And also, this brings us to the next event, YCS Pasadena. So the top 32 breakdown was, I mean, in terms of the types of decks you saw there, is pretty much the same, but different representation. Orcists at 50% representation. That's insane. So half the decks there were basically Orcists, and that makes sense. So this kind of seems like a cop out. Sky Strikers um, saw 19% representation, but the reason why I say that sounds kind of like a cop out is that there's kind of like this new variant on Sky Strikers. They call it Sky Striker Orcists, where they're basically using an Orcust deck and they're using Sky Strikers as an engine. So this is kind of like the first time we've seen this kind of very like well put together mix where it actually showed up in a tournament. I mean, we've seen some experimentation in a couple of lower division tournaments, but now we're starting to see it to actually come into fruition. So Sky Striker Orchists, yeah, they're in 19%, and Sky Strikers themselves included in that bracket. So Salamangreat at 13% makes sense. They're kind of like that third, I guess the third best deck right now in terms of the meta. But yeah, that makes sense. Pendulum Magicians. This is kind of crazy too. We thought Pendulum Magicians were kind of dying for the most part, but no. Turns out they're back at 6%. Same with Thunder Dragons. So it's kind of interesting to see. My theory is that because Thunder Dragons are kind of winding down more, or kind of going more toward, I guess, the same strength as Pendulum Magicians, if that makes sense. Basically, what I'm saying is like I'm saying Thunder Dragons and Pendulum Magicians are around the same intensity level or same strength level. So I guess you can say that Pendulum Magicians are finding a better opportunity of making themselves being expressed in the meta in terms of negating Thunder Dragon's abilities, and also the Sky Striker Orcus variant is also providing Thunder Dragons an equally great opportunity to stay in the meta because before Sky Strikers weren't too, or I mean not Sky Strikers, Thunder Dragons weren't too effective against Orcists, but now that Sky Strikers are combined with Orcists, Sky Strikers do bring in a search kind of strategy into the meta, which Thunder Dragons can kind of lock out half of this Sky Striker Orcust strategy. So it's interesting how to see these Pendulum Magicians, these Thunder Dragon decks, and these Sky Striker Orcust decks kind of almost affect themselves in a way. And also True King dinosaurs and just dinosaurs in general at 3% along with Altergeists. So Altergeists, I kind of expected they were just kind of lurking there at that very bottom tier of the meta, but dinosaurs and True King dinosaurs, that kind of took me by surprise. I mean, dinosaurs have historically always been like a good deck, well, for the most part, but True King dinosaurs, that's kind of an interesting mix. I haven't seen that before. But you have stuff like Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, which is no pushover in himself, and combining other huge beaters like True Kings. Yeah, it kind of makes sense that these True King dinosaurs is coming into the meta, especially that we kind of see more of an OTK kind of strategy seeping into the meta uh, strategy in general. So yeah, that's kind of interesting to see. This meta is going to largely be OTK influenced. And so the results of YCS Pasadena, you could say, is they kind of unveiled the Sky Striker Orcust strategy, and of course, it wasn't just an Orcust deck that took first place. It was this particular Sky Striker Orcusts. So you had the meeting of the minds essentially. That you took two of the top tier decks, being Sky Strikers and Orcusts, and you basically combined them together. So I guess in a way, these two decks had their shortcomings. Orcusts having very, very low shortcomings. Sky Strikers having quite a bit more shortcomings ever since Widow Anchor got hit. But basically, when you got the fusion of these two decks, they kind of almost bridge the gap between their weaknesses, you could say. Yeah, they still do have they open themselves up to Thunder Dragons in terms of Thunder Dragons being able to stop their search effects, but still overall they overcompensate for it in just their newfound basically strengths, well, having the Sky Striker engine to basically pull on those grindy games with your opponent and just outlast your opponent if you need to. And on top with Orcists, they have stuff like Dengirsu and um, other huge beater Orcists that can basically OTK your opponent. Um, so I guess what you can say is now that we've seen stuff like especially the fusion between Sky Strikers and Orcists, and new decks coming into the meta like Gladiator Beasts and Madolches, you could say that YCS Pasadena was kind of like a breeding ground for almost experimentation, and I mean that's always welcome. I'm always glad to see that within the Yu-Gi-Oh meta. It's healthy and it's helps stop the basically the traditional meta. Like I'm sure if you've been playing for a while that you've probably noticed that before, like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there may be like two or one deck or like one or two decks that were basically top tier. If you weren't playing those decks, you basically weren't winning. So that's a huge contrast from Yu-Gi-Oh in the past and now. So I would say, yeah, now you get to experiment with your more of your favorite decks. Um, so yeah, you have stuff like Sky Striker Orcists, which is a bit, I guess, kind of a hybrid of the meta, and then Pendulum Magicians becoming more susceptible to Thunder Dragon search effects, and it's nice to see. It's always nice to see experimentation, and I I'm very excited to see how this goes in the future for tournaments. And so this brings us to our last few tournaments, and I'm gonna kind of combine these together: the Yu-Gi-Oh Toronto Regional and the YCS Milan tournament. So Sky Striker Orcists took first place in the Toronto Regional. No surprise there. So I mean, it's just solidified its dominance so much. I mean, some people are saying, well, we can't pull the trigger quite yet. It's too early to see if these Sky Striker Orcists are going to last the test of time. I mean, honestly, being how effective they are at OTKing and basically outmaneuvering your opponent and basically drawing up their resources, it's safe to say that they're going to stay. Um, what was interesting is in this Toronto regional, that Train OTK took second place, so that was really out of left field. I mean, I guess the only reason why you could, the only reason why like you could see them taking second place was because they took advantage of this OTK strategy essentially. So, I mean, trains are no joke in this straight up fight, but yeah, it's kind of crazy to see them uh, just kind of fly out into the meta scene this suddenly. And another anomaly, I mean, good, especially that I love stun decks, and it's kind of brought a smile to my face when I saw it. Was Frog Toad deck made the top 32 cut in the Toronto Regional. So yeah, again capitalizing off of what I said before, this heavy trap lineup, and especially uh, it was particular Paleozoic frog deck. So I remember seeing the deck profile too, and it was if I recall there were no spells. There were pretty much all traps and just monsters. Yeah, just all monsters and traps. And so yeah, I mean it kind of speaks to its success. It basically sets a bunch of heavy back row, and the meta kind of doesn't know how to respond to it other than Twin Twisters and Cosmic Cyclone. So I mean, a lot of traps are just left to resolve, and maybe the opponent might trigger off a hand trap to try to negate one of those traps, but they're not going to see too much success because they're more geared toward battling the opponent and activating spell cards rather than dealing with traps, as we've seen in tournaments of the very far past. So, yeah, frogs are able just to slow down other meta decks with this kind of trap strategy and just kind of slowly pick apart the field and basically put things on the board like totally awesome and kind of control the field. So What I'm saying is the meta isn't really good against control strategies, especially trap-based control strategies. So this kind of points out a huge weakness in the meta that I've largely criticized for a long time, even before I've been making videos like this. But yeah, it's kind of surreal to see this actually come to fruition. And we're just going to speak briefly about YCS Milan because there's still news coming out for YCS Milan, more updates. But again, surprise, surprise, Sky Striker Orchists, he took first place at YCS Milan. Again, like I said, solidifying their dominance in the meta. It's interesting to see if this will completely edge out the pure Orchist and the pure Sky Striker variants. I would say between the two, pure Sky Strikers will probably be edged out, and they'll probably see most play in Orchist strategies. That Sky Striker Orchist kind of combo. So yeah, what was I mean, again, it's not a surprise. The YCS Milan's top 32 breakdown composed mostly of Orcus decks, so everyone pretty much got the hint. They're basically saying Orcus are the best deck, and they're kind of taking advantage of this. So I mean, makes sense if you're gonna go to YCS. Might as well play with the best deck. Go big or go home, right? But yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of the video, and yeah, sorry, this was kind of a huge, kind of a lengthy video, but there's just been a lot going on in the Yu-Gi-Oh tournament scene and just meta in general. So I just wanted to do this. The video was kind of meant like more of like a rapid fire session to kind of give you a concise kind of news and details about the meta. If you just wanted to get caught up with the recent events that have been happening, so this wasn't like a very deep dive as into each specific deck, but this is more like a relay of results of the tournaments in general and just highlights, you could say. Um, but yeah, with that, thank you for watching my video. If you want to help support this channel, you can do so on Patreon. Um, you don't have to, but just, I mean, if you want to, you can, but if you don't, just keep watching. Your views are appreciated and just your support in general. But yeah, with that, I'll catch you guys in the next video, and I look forward to bringing you more content. All right, take care. Bye.